Well, welcome everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Walter Gavan, President of the Alabama World Affairs Council. I'm also Senior Vice Chancellor for Advancement and Economic Development at Troy University, which is where I'm coming to you from. But I want to welcome you to this joint NATO and World Affairs Councils of America event on space as an operational domain for NATO. But first, please, let me thank Bill Clifford, President of the World Affairs Councils of America, and Damien Arnault of the NATO staff for helping to make this NATO 2030 event possible. We're very privileged and grateful to be selected as one of the World Affairs Councils to host an event. And we felt the space was absolutely the perfect subject for us, both because we have Air University here in Montgomery, Alabama, at Maxwell Air Force Base, but we also have the George Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, which has also been designated as the future home of U.S. Space Command. So we're a very aerospace oriented state and happy to host this event. And I'd like to thank all of you who are joining us in the virtual world for this particular event. It's been great to watch how we've adapted and I would argue really expanded our reach and our capabilities as World Affairs Councils through this adaptation to the circumstances. Well, I think we're going to be better for it going forward, even as the pandemic lessens. At this point, let me introduce our guests. I want to welcome two guests who will discuss the implications of NATO looking now at space as an operational domain. First, very privileged to have with us Camille Gon. He is the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO headquarters. He was previously Director and Chief Executive Officer of La Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, FRS, the French. This is the leading French think tank for defense and security. And in that capacity, he served on several expert groups on the future of NATO. His research and publications focused on defense policy, NATO, nuclear policy, and missile defense. He was also Deputy Director for Disarmament and Multilateral Affairs in the Directorate of Strategic Security and Disarmament Affairs of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Bienvenue en Alabama.
Merci beaucoup.
And we have with us also Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mulder. He is the Senior U.S. Air Force Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security of the Atlantic Council, where he is writing and engaging on space, emerging technology, national security, and defense issues. He has significant operational and staff experience in the NATO theater, having flown F-16s with the 480th Fighter Squadron at Spangdahlem Air Base, Germany. And he also served as aide-de-camp to the United States Air Forces in Europe and Africa commander, who at that time was General Frank Gorentz, a great friend of mine, with whom I flew F-15s in Bitburg, Germany, way back when, in the waning days of the Cold War, if anyone can remember that. Welcome to you both. We will begin our program today with a moderated discussion with our two guests. We'll do that for roughly about half the time that we have. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the audience for your questions. And the way we found that generally works best, if you would feed your questions to the chat, the group chat feature, then I will field the questions and deliver them to our panelists roughly in the order in which they were received. And we'll start that portion and open it up here in a few minutes. But first, let's begin with our NATO guest, Assistant Secretary General Gon. Camille, NATO members have long been engaged in space as national capabilities, and they brought those national capabilities to their participation in the alliance. What led NATO to declare that space and recognize space as an operational domain in 2019?
Well, it might at first sight, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be with you and to partner with the World Affairs Council for this event. And I'm super thrilled that my colleagues at NATO thought of this topic and to do it with you there. But let me say that the interesting thing is, of course, one could at first sight say, why would NATO wait for 70 years to recognize space as a domain of operation? It was recognized in 2019, and obviously the NATO, the Washington Treaty was signed in 1949. So, but the reality is there are two competing trends. First of all, of course, we were using space technology. We were even launching our own satellites 50 years ago. So it's not as if NATO had been ignoring space for the last 70 years and suddenly discovered it a couple of years ago. But the reality is that the space environment has become more congested, more competitive, and also in a growing number of threats on those assets that have become so critical to military operations. So this is why the alliance has decided to come together at 30 with all 30 allies involved to raise our awareness on the criticality of space, to work together where and when needed, and to develop what we call space situational awareness of what's happening in our environment as an alliance, because the conclusion that the allies came to is that it was not sufficient to rely on the space capabilities of a handful of allies, but it was really needed to work on this as an alliance and to develop a number of tools together. So that has been the focus there. So there was a decision to establish a NATO space center at the Air Command in Ramstein, Germany. And we are now working on a number of work strands to see what we can do better and together. So that's exactly where we want to take it. It comes from the analysis of the threat environment, of the challenges that we face in space, the recognition that we are so dependent on space technology and space assets that we can't afford to ignore that domain, and on the opportunity to work together. And we'll see how far we take this. I mean, are we going to do more of what we do, that is buying space services and so on and so forth, and expanding our command capability, or are we going to go a step further and work on specific assets, doctrinal work, and working on also the legal dimension of the operations in outer space? You know, all of this is really extremely important. And with more and more allies investing in the military space, it is and relying on civilian space, it is more and more important that we do this together.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Chris, let me turn to you on that. You were a warfighter engaged in operations in the NATO theater. Now you're looking at a bigger picture as a fellow at the Atlantic Council. What advantages do you see that it brings to have space acknowledged as an operational domain for NATO?
Yeah, thanks, General, for having me in the Atlanta World Affairs Council. Really privileged and honored to be asked to do this. When I was doing my research, I noticed that the council was formed in 1918, the same year that the Spanish flu had, significant impacts across the world. And here we are in 2021, fighting our way out of, the COVID crisis. And in 1918, 20 to 50 million people were killed. COVID, I think 3 million plus have been killed. And I would think that space, played a role in limiting some of that through communication, information sharing. And so just to advance into the future is really, mind-blowing. Camille, I saw you had 3 boys. I have 3, children myself. My girl is 5 years old. In 2116, she will be 95 years old. That's 66% longer than the strategy paper that I co-authored goes out to. And just to think where space will be at in 2116 is really mind-blowing, and why it's so important, why NATO, United States, and other allies and partners have a vision and develop a strategy, to make sure that the space domain serves our own interests. And I think, from an operational domain perspective and a warfighter perspective, we're in great power competition. China, Russia are placing multiple different assets. They're developing anti-satellite weapons. And it's just a natural next step where we operationalize, the domain. The United States Air Force has actually called it a warfighting domain in the 2020 Defense Space Strategy, and actually has taken it one step further, I would say, than what NATO has referred to as an operational domain.
Thanks. Yeah, that kind of gets into that's interesting. I'm going to go ahead and raise this. I actually had another question, but let me raise this because you kind of brought it up. This idea that okay, we're going to be engaged here. Is it a warfighting domain? And if it is a warfighting domain, Camille, are y'all talking about? Are you talking about when Article 5 applies in terms of space engagement? I mean, are those kind of questions being discussed now at NATO headquarters? Space is an operational domain. We understand the many capabilities that come from it, but it also potentially could see kinetic capabilities used. And what are the implications of that for the alliance?
No, first of all, Article 5, so NATO's most known article that deals with one for all and all for one, and or it's a sort of solidarity principle, does apply if something happens in space. Obviously, NATO was conceived as a treaty for the North Atlantic area, so from the West Coast to the borders of Europe, and from the North Pole to the Tropic of Cancer. But we've recognized that there are domains, and including space and cyberspace, where that don't see classical geographical boundaries. So we have to recognize that an attack on a space asset has consequences and could trigger an Article 5 conversation with allies, and then allies would decide. But to be absolutely transparent about this, indeed, or the alliance experts and lawyers and warfighters are discussing this precisely because we can see situations in which an attack on a space asset would be of such a magnitude that we would call an Article 5. Of course, this is not the initial thinking in a treaty, but neither was 9/11, which is the only time when we triggered Article 5. So you can imagine a situation in which this happens. Then looking at space from a NATO perspective, what we and Chris rightfully pointed at what strategic competitors are doing in space, and they are definitely engaged into trying to build up a space capability that is comparable to that of the US, or even better, if that's definitely what they're trying to do. But they're also very focused on denying our ability to use space to our advantage. So the point is not so much in entering into an arms race and having a sort of Star Wars competition in outer space, but to make sure that our space assets are sufficiently protected, are sufficiently redundant, so that our reliance on those space assets, whether it's for positioning, early warning, communications, you name it, don't become a vulnerability because they are themselves vulnerable to potential adversaries' attack. And Chris rightly pointed to anti-satellite tests conducted by the Chinese in particular in the recent years that are that we should understand for what they were, that is demonstrating an ability to deny access to space. And then from that perspective, The interesting thing is that there are plenty of things you can do to do that. You can harden your systems. You can have more systems in outer space. So do you create redundancy and no single point failure? But you can also work with your allies. So for instance, when there are adversaries that are using GPS jamming in order to deny the benefits of GPS, this global positioning system that we use, that our military use, if you do create a situation where you also use, for instance, the European system, Galileo, you make the efforts to jam you and to deny the benefits of having GPS much more difficult to the adversary. So there are plenty of things you can think of, but for that, it's very important that we as allies work together and create redundancies and support each other, so that even the strongest of our allies, the US, obviously, can also benefit from the other assets brought to the table by allies in an environment where our competitors are really trying to deny our advantage in space.
Very good. Chris, as I was listening to Camille, it really started making me think about strategy. Because I'm hearing the elements of a strategy, and I know you've thought a lot about strategy. So if you would, any thoughts on what you're seeing or what you think should happen as far as a NATO space strategy?
Yeah, just to rewind, a quick second. I spent the last 8 months helping the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security develop a paper titled "The Future of Security in Space, a 30-Year U.S. Strategy." It was a team effort. I have 3 co-authors on that paper, Secretary Deborah James and General Cartwright. The first one was the Secretary of the Air Force, and General Cartwright, the Vice Chairman, Chief of Staff, and the Strategic Command Commander, provided strategic guidance to us. We consulted and interviewed multiple different people to pull this strategy together. And we were trying to initially figure out, how far do we want the strategy to go out? Do we go 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years? And in that initial research, we settled on 30 years. There are strategies that talk about a 10-year time period. I mentioned one, the defense space strategy. The Space Command has a paper out that talks about space in 2060 that's semi-strategy-like. And we thought 30 years that we could identify some short, medium, and long-term recommendations and action items, because nothing will happen tomorrow. Things take many, many years to develop. And so we settled on this on 30 years. We thought it was actionable. Discussions like this, people can come together, have the discourse, have the dialogue. And so, when I was doing the research specific with NATO, they came out with the policy in 2019 and declared the operational domain, but the policy remains classified. They do have some elements of what the policy, I think, generally drives toward. The Joint Air Power Competency Center has been writing quite a bit about space in NATO, and suggesting that NATO, looks at some sort of a strategy. And so, to get to the bottom line, sir, I think that the United States and the allies and partners should come together and develop the strategy. First, you need a vision, you need goals, and then you can develop the strategy to actually execute and meet the goals. There really isn't a whole lot of literature out there when it, no kidding, comes to definitive strategies for space. Things are happening so quickly. I was laughing just riding my bike the other day. There's all these electrical scooters all over the streets. And that's a perfect example, and there's hundreds of examples, but that's a perfect example where technology, entrepreneurs, willpower, the dynamics are such where the regulation and the governance hasn't caught up with the electrical scooter phenomena. it causes safety concerns, a lot of issues, and not that space is directly correlated with that, but I think it's a decent analogy.
Camille, we got a big event coming up here in June. June 14th will be the next summit of allied leaders at NATO headquarters, excuse me, in Brussels. And notably, this will be President Biden's first encounter with the allies in his new capacity as President of the United States. Will space figure prominently in these discussions among the leaders, do you think?
I do expect first of all, you're right, the NATO's summit on the 14th of June is going to be a major event. It is the first summit that President Biden attends, even though he was quite familiar with NATO in various capacities in the Senate and as vice president, but that's indeed his first engagement with his peers. And also his first visit to Europe that very week. So that's going to be a very important event, as always, in the first months of a new US administration. For us, obviously, when we decided to offer to allies, and that is still under negotiation, is to go for, even though the summit is going to be quite short, is to go for a full summit, meaning that we will have a NATO, what we call communique, which is a lengthy text that does capture what we're doing and what we intend to do, and seek the support of the leaders for that. And there will be a section devoted to space, because indeed we did have not only recognize space as a domain operation, but we did have endorsed a space policy. We're now working on a strategy with our military colleagues, so it's a bit of back and forth. So we really want the leaders to sort of support that direction of travel. It will take probably another year or so, till our next summit next year, to really pull this together and say, okay, these are the things we want to do at 30. These are the things where we expect allies to support us. In the interim, there will be, NATO is establishing also a center of excellence on space that will be based in France. And that's the first ever NATO center of excellence that will be hosted in France, and that will be on space, which is interesting. Yeah. There will be, we will have decisions, and we will assess more closely our vulnerabilities that I was discussing earlier. We will, of course, look forward to the US space strategy and to dig into this and sort of exchange on where do alliances fit into this. So all of this is going to be a very interesting series of documents, decisions. But of course, the NATO Summit is a very big milestone into this, because as an alliance, as I always say, I have one boss, which is the Secretary General. But in practice, I have 30 bosses. I need all the allies to be on board with what we do, to be supportive of what we do, to be ready to fund what we do. And that takes a little bit of time, a little traction, but we are really very much getting there. And on space, it's very interesting to see how fast we've moved from the, let's say, what could be a bit of a symbolic statement. Okay, space is a domain of operation, to actually operationalize that into a series of actual decisions that will make NATO a space player more than it currently is. We're already a bit in, for instance, the satellite communication business. I just supported the signature of a $1 billion contract to provide space satellite communication services to the alliance. It's one of our biggest investments. But on the other hand, next to that, the issue is what do we do on top of that, over and above those traditional lines of efforts? And that's a very interesting moment, I must admit.
Yeah, I appreciate your mentioning that investment. That was really huge. In the idea that NATO as an alliance would make that kind of investment. And I think obviously sort of starting at right where it counts in terms of the kind of services that it's doing. So I meant to applaud you for that effort and congratulate you on that. I know a big achievement for you in your job. Chris, we're talking about how this gets implemented. you've been at Ramstein, obviously very familiar with the kind of command and control that we have there, and understand now that NATO has stood up a space center there. Your thoughts on the command and control and the function of the space center?
Yeah, I think one, it's a great opportunity. I'm happy to see that NATO stood up this initial space center at Allied Air Component Command at Ramstein. And I think where they can make their money is probably pulling together all the 30 bosses like Camille mentioned, and start having the conversations, maybe even categorize the different capabilities that each of the nations has available. Since right now, each nation acts in their own independent capacity when it comes to space. But I think if NATO, and they probably do, but if they don't, if they had a clear picture of all the capabilities that all the nations can bring, to the operational domain, I think that might be a opportunity for the new space center to plug in and also develop doctrine. Obviously they'll probably have a role in the strategy, and just have discussions, reach out, build relationships maybe with other nations outside of NATO, see what the other, spacefaring nations are up to, pull ideas from them. So those are just initial thoughts that the NATO Space Center can participate in.
Camille, Camille, if you could just add to that, any other thoughts on the Space Center and NATO's ambitions for its role?
I think we have to be honest. This is not a space command as the one that you will soon get, and it's not meant to be. But on the other hand, but we will see how it grows and how far it grows. So let's never say never. In a way, it's already quite an ambitious effort that our military colleagues are putting forward. And I hope the nations will really endorse that, because it makes a lot of sense. The issue is really to pull together, I would say, two things. One part is what Chris mentioned. We have more and more allies that are working on space assets, that do have, that are flying satellites. Access to space has become easier. So if you want to have a nano satellite launch as part of a constellation, if you want to have a nano or micro satellite that is there, the overall price for having space assets has dropped very significantly over the last few years. So it means that we have more and more allies that are relevant to this space conversation. Maybe a couple of decades ago, it was primarily the US and to a certain extent, France, UK, Germany, Italy, and that was more or less it. Now we do have more and more allies that are part of this. So bringing them together, explaining to them the sensitivities, working on what they have, including when it's some that are governmental but civilian assets that can be useful, on which you can add payload to reinforce your resilience and so on. So there are plenty of small interesting things to do there. And we have more and more allies that are developing their own space commands. I've chaired a number of NATO meetings in our defense policy and planning committee, where suddenly it was very interesting to see allies that I didn't think about, who would say, well, we are setting up something in space. We have one of our smallest allies by size, Luxembourg, that is a spacefaring nation, and that is putting money on the table, projects on the table, and supporting what we do. And even though it's one of the smallest allies by size and population. So that's one part. Then the second part is within NATO, we do have this ecosystem pre-existing of NATO entities that work on space. The NATO Communication and Information Agency, that's the agency that I oversee and that has been signing those contracts for space services in the domain of satellite communication. But they have a deep expertise in multiple domains because they also do air and missile defense technology. So they've looked at a number of issues associated with space. We have the legal colleagues that are looking at those Article 5 and what does that do? So how do we work with them? We have the colleagues, and I'm one of them, who work with the European Union once in a while, say, okay, well, how do we put space as a topic on our NATO-EU relationship, and how do we work with them? And then, of course, all the military colleagues, which have already been using in SHAPE, in Ramstein, in ACT space technology, have been focusing on that. But no one is sort of bringing more coherence into that. So that's going to be a very interesting element of this growing NATO space policy, is not only to bring the allies together, but also to bring together the variable NATO entities so that we can work together and push in the same direction to put a lot of more coherence in our space policy and to be able to face a very competitive environment once again together.
Yeah, very good point. And I'll just add a little personal testimony to what you talked about with the nano satellite capability. When I was still in the Air Force, I was at one point I was the commandant of the Air Force Institute of Technology, which is the Air Force's technical graduate school. And we actually put in a nano satellite that we had built ourselves, and we put on as an additional payload on a flight. And I literally have some stick time flying that satellite from the Air Force Institute of Technology. But what it taught me, it wasn't one that it was just extraordinary that that kind of capability was available to a very small entity. And so certainly now you can't say, oh, you're not a superpower, you don't get to play in space. It's very much opened up to many more players. So I think it's an excellent point. It's good that NATO is taking that into consideration. Chris, I want to get to something that I know is near and dear to your heart. We talk about space, and we talk about space forces. We talk about this in a NATO context. You just came not long ago from commanding a squadron at a base where we do joint Euro-NATO pilot training here in the U.S., which has been a great model for a joint training. Do you see that model potentially applying to space forces and how they might train or develop together?
Yeah, I do just want to remind everybody, I am speaking in my own personal capacity. But yeah, the experience I had at Shepherd Air Force Base at the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program was just a wonderful, joint, culturally diverse, experience where we were training reserve and guard from our nation, from the US. And then I think it was a total of 14 nations participated in the program in some capacity, some more than others. Germany, Italy were some of the big players. But the relationships that the students, built with each other, the instructors built with the students, and you fast forward that 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and you participate in a campaign like Operation Unified Protector. That was a NATO led campaign that removed Gaddafi in Libya. So some of the results are somewhat soft in that it's hard to necessarily quantify every single benefit. But I do see the space domain as a new opportunity or new fledgling construct to partner in a formal way with the other NATO spacefaring nations. Does that necessarily mean that we have to physically be somewhere to train? I mean, we saw during COVID that you can do distributed and remote learning and engagement. And so I could see, a disaggregated NJET program virtually. I don't even know if you need to pull people together in one place. I think it's always better. So the bottom line is, yes, I do see a potential opportunity there.
Great. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and start making a transition to our questions. We've already gotten several from the audience, and I would what I will do is I will actually read these questions or try to paraphrase them. But if you would just go to, as a reminder, if you would go to the chat feature and say send to everyone and put your questions there, and I will relay them as best I can. I may do slight editing, so please indulge me as I take that responsibility. So the first question is from Peter, and he says it's about communication and guidance in a weapon system. It is using communications guidance systems that are space-based, say, in the case of potentially could be used for weapons of mass destruction. Is that an infringement, possibly an infringement of the international treaty on the use of outer space? And this really gets into the sort of the how much, we talked about the Article 5 aspect of this, but it's kind of getting into how much bleed over do we get from one thing to another, in that space is used for so many things. What is considered part of that whole system? And we know, obviously, that a lot of the ballistic missile capabilities that go through space are part of that. So I'd just be interested in our panelists weighing in on that to the extent that considerations about what can and can't be used in space and what treaties govern it. Either one of you want to jump in?
I can give it a shot, but I'm sure Chris will have points to add to this one. It's one of the complex issues, to be honest. First of all, there is indeed a treaty that bans the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in space. So formally, all the signatories are not supposed to deploy typically a nuclear weapon in space. Because that was viewed at the time, we're talking 1967, as potentially destabilizing and as something that could be a threat to the balance of deterrence by having these such weapons deployed in space there. Of course, since then, there has been an ongoing conversation for diplomats and experts in Geneva and Vienna on how do we, can we prevent an arms race in outer space? What sort of rules can we apply in space? Interestingly, some of our peer competitors have been arguing for a treaty when they are probably those who are the more infringing on this principle of the peaceful use of outer space, or at least a non-deployment, not so much of military capabilities, because we've deployed military capabilities, so we can't say there is no deployment of military assets in space. Well, that's what major powers do. But the deployment of offensive capabilities in space or activities that are closer to a form of weaponization of space. So that is a bit the big international law debate on how much can we go there. Going more specifically to the question, the issue is, and some have argued, and I would disagree with that the use of space assets in support of a mission, typically of the nuclear mission, makes it a part of that nuclear deterrent mission. I tend to disagree with that because I think it's pushing, the sort of connection between the early warning systems, the command and control systems, too far by dragging them closer to the weapon. So we have to be very clear on that. There might be, in the event of a nuclear war, God forbid, flying objects that carry nuclear weapons through space, but they are not space-based. They are just flying through outer space as they would fly in the air for other weapon systems such as cruise missiles or bombers. So that doesn't make them space weapons per se. Then at the end of the day, I nevertheless do think that we need to, as the West, as NATO, come with a strong legal argument to be able to tell others there are certain things you shouldn't do. And for instance, the use of anti-satellite weapons is something that should be prevented as much as possible, because not only it could be destabilizing, but that is an intent that some might see benefits in having this. But more importantly, the consequences of the destruction of a satellite will create a form of pollution in outer space that will have an impact on all of our civilian activities. And we've seen that through the couple of tests conducted by the Chinese in particular, is that they create space debris that then become a problem for everything we do. So just as we forbidden, for instance, weapon systems that change the environment and would trigger, I don't know, a tornado, we are trying to, I think it's healthy and it's good behavior. So the issue is, how do we have a sort of governance that recognize that there are certain things you don't do, and that if you do them, it's really an act of war, and you should not, you should suffer the consequences of that. So it's really at the juncture of law, good practice, and technical management of space situational awareness, and I would say in everyone's benefit of not ruining the outer space by having debris all over the place that make all the peaceful use of space much more difficult to perform.
Well put and well summarized. Thank you. Chris, any additional thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'll just say that it is an insightful question, and specifically when Camille mentioned the debris in space, that China ASAT test where they destroyed their weather satellite, I think it put 15 to 20,000 pieces of debris in low Earth orbit that we're having to track and dodge. And but that question really gets out of ethical and responsible uses of space. An aha moment I had was thinking pre-1957, so pre-Sputnik. Humans have actually been using celestial bodies for military uses, for defense, and for many purposes for many, many years. From a position, navigation, and timing, it was just a rudimentary way to use the stars. But I think humans did a very, very good job of using stars pre-1957. We're just in an advanced state currently, and to be honest with you, from a timeline, and I mentioned that up front, we're actually at the very beginning of radical new technologies and new uses of space, that when my daughter is at the end of her life, what she will experience in 2116 will completely blow our minds, and we can't even comprehend what that will look like in the current state of affairs. So I'm a big proponent of using the domain, all domains, actually in a sustainable way, ethically, responsibly, to the max extent possible. Just a few thoughts.
No, thank you. Good thoughts. I have a question now from Moses, and he says he really gets to what we're talking about, and you alluded to earlier, Camille, about the redundant perhaps capabilities. He says, since NATO relies on national space assets, how does NATO build collaboration among allies who are also competing in space? So, we talked about GPS, we talked about Galileo. There's a redundancy there, but is there also a competition? And of course, as a fighter pilot used to having things in my aircraft, does this present an acquisition issue now of, I've got to have a Galileo receiver as well as a GPS receiver if I'm going to fly in NATO? Any thoughts, Camille?
Yeah, it's obviously, let's be clear and honest on that. There is, especially in the civilian sector, a massive competition between industries within the US, between US and European companies, with some other players, that are becoming operators for space launch, for satellites building, and we do have a severe competition is in the civilian domain for all these space assets and services. That is part of just like in the aerospace, and that is and now the issue is how do we make the best out of that? Because the good news is the US and Europe are still amongst the leading space nation for the US and series of nations for the Europeans that are devoting the second largest space budget in the world is that of the European Union after the US. Probably with the Chinese catching up pretty fast, but it is there. So we know that, on the one hand, we have China and Russia that are big space players, but on the Western side, we do have a number of allies that are either already players or becoming players in this domain. So how do we make that work? And there, let me share an interesting story on GPS and Galileo. In a previous capacity as a special assistant to the French Minister of Defense, I had to deal in the early 2000s with actual concerns from US colleagues saying, why are you pushing this Galileo thing in the military domain? This is, going to make things messy. Why don't you use GPS? That's just as good. Which was factually and technically quite a good idea. There was a lot of validity to that statement. Very interestingly, in my new capacity a couple of years ago, meeting colleagues in the Pentagon, under the Trump administration, I had colleagues doing space policy in the Pentagon telling me, you know what, Galileo is offering a redundancy that is very interesting. And we do see the benefit of equipping our major ships and airplanes and land vehicle with a Galileo receiver, because precisely, and I come back to the point I was making earlier very quickly, it makes the ability of adversaries to do GPS jamming, GPS spoofing, all these things that our adversaries are really focused on because they know it's one of the things we're good at. As Western military powers, more difficult. So today you had a sort of flip from that perspective to seeing the benefit of having some redundancy. So then, of course, the point is not having everything redundant. The point is in saying we have to pick and choose where redundancy and having different technologies operated at the same time give us more confidence that no adversary will be able to sort of target our Achilles heel by taking down a critical capacity, whether it's in communications or in positioning or in intelligence, for instance. Then a last idea, which I think is interesting when it comes to space. I was talking about my 1 billion euro or dollar contract. Interestingly, this has been won by a consortium with US, Italy, France, and Germany, and the UK pulling forces together and saying, okay, we will make that service available through a variety of tools. So you have a series of companies, some of them are American, some of them are European, which are offering those services to the whole of NATO, paid for by the 30. So you can see that there can be, in multiple instances, good cooperation between the two sides of the Atlantic on developing a service or developing a technology that is useful to the whole of NATO. So at the end of the day, competition is good, and I would never argue against competition. But I would say that cooperation can be even better in the space domain amongst allies.
Great, good. Chris, any thoughts on that question?
No, I'll defer to Camille on the answer.
Okay, good. We got another question about which really gets to something that is one of those awkward things in a way. But how do we hold nations accountable for bad behavior in space? I mean, and I think it gets to a little bit of what we were talking about with the Chinese ASAT test against their own satellite, which left that huge debris field. Is there any parallel there with how we do, treat international waters, for example, or what is the approach there, Camille?
The issue, I mean, when we look at what those countries are doing, I mean, there is one part which is absolutely legit. They have been spacefaring nations for decades, and they rely on space for their own military, just as we do to a large extent. And we shouldn't be arguing that China or Russia is not allowed to do to fly objects in space and operate with space. And it can have, by the way, some virtues in terms of stability. For instance, I think that the fact that the Russians have some good early warning helps for the stability of nuclear deterrence. When the fact that the Chinese don't have such good early warning doesn't help in our having a stable deterrence relationship with them. So again, there are things where developments in their space policy can be somewhat useful to the overall stability. On the other hand, and there I will say that I'm more worried than optimistic, is what we see is a very deliberate effort to build up not only similar capabilities, but also assets that are literally targeted at denying the US space dominance, the NATO ability to operate through space assets. And this is where we're getting in very dangerous waters, because if you do blind your adversary, or if you deny a major service, suddenly you have a sense of something going really wrong, but this is not necessarily good tactics, because you don't necessarily want to create a situation where, let's say, the US commander of PACOM says, I've lost track of my assets because my GPS is down, or I've lost a key satellite and I don't know what happened, because it might be a technical failure, but it might also be an ASAT system. Mm-hmm. So this is where I think working on good behavior, working on saying, okay, there are things you can do, there are things that are, and this is one of the reasons why at NATO we are not advocating for a form of arms race in space. What we're saying is, let's have the right level of effort on this, but let's not necessarily turn space into an actual physical fighting domain. I would argue, I would agree with Chris that it is a fighting domain in the sense of there is a competition there, and there is there are a number of strategic challenges there. But we don't want this to be the Wild West, if I may use an American metaphor. We need it to be a bit governed, and that's the way I would put it. And this is where I'm slightly worried with some of the new players, starting with not so new when we talk about China or Russia, that are very much focused on denial capabilities, capabilities that are meant to disable other space assets rather than enablers that sort of do that. And also, let me end on an additional footnote. There are, newcomers such as Iran and a few others that we must watch very carefully, because their technology might be relatively rudimentary, but this is precisely when you do silly things, if I may put it this way, or dangerous things.
That's good. We're getting close on time. What I'd like to do now, Chris, I'll let you respond with any additional thoughts and then any concluding thoughts, and then I'll give the last word to Camille before we wrap up. Chris?
Sure, yeah. All I say to that, that's one of our main points in the paper that we wrote. One, creating rules of the road, new governance structures, and that takes time. It'll take discussion and dialogue to lay out exactly how allies and partners want space to look like in the future. And once we have that common operating picture, I think everything else will sort of, come to fruition, and you'll be able to hold nefarious actors to account a little bit better. Right now, we just don't have the mechanisms to do that. You can publicly, write that whatever the activity was nefarious, like when the Chinese launched their first space center module, and then the rocket that came back, no one knew where it was going to land, and it could have, impacted civilians on the ground. Thankfully, it landed, I think, in the Indian Ocean, and no one was impacted. But that would be an example of where there should have been communication, and it should have been better coordinated, and the Chinese should have had a better plan to get that material back to Earth, so it wouldn't potentially impact humans on the ground. My final point is thanks again, sir, and the World Affairs Council for having me. I'm happy to have follow-on discussions. One of the things with our paper is we humbly lay out the strategy, but it's really a vehicle to get feedback and to have discourse and dialogue. And so we can make, the space domain better and also the Earth better for people like my daughter, who's 5 years old, and so if I can make it a little bit better through developing a strategy and having discussions, I'm happy to do that and love feedback. So thanks again.
Thank you, Chris. Camille, any concluding thoughts?
First of all, as Chris, let me thank you really for great hosting, and to all those who attended this conversation. It's really a fantastic opportunity to bring NATO even virtually to different audiences and have a very good conversation. And the quality of the conversation was really useful for me as well to really test some of our ideas and hear from you where we need to explain better, where we need to focus our efforts as well. On space, the last thought I would leave with you is that I think we have to recognize that this is for many of us, space we were dreaming about, sending man into space, sending a man on the moon, all these things have been absolutely critical to our history. And for my generation, obviously, those are things that we've watched and heard of constantly. The issue now is that it has become part of our daily lives. People don't notice that, even in our military. I'm going to say this to Air Force men, but I've had Army people telling me, "Oh, is GPS is it a space service? Because I never thought it was." And you say, "Where do you think the signal is coming from?" So, anyways, the issue is how do we collectively continue to leverage that fantastic asset for our alliance, for our military, and for our nations, without facing a situation where this is being constantly contested, and potentially denied. I think our entire lives depend on those space assets today more and more. And we are, I read somewhere, Chris might correct me, the fact that we were launching more objects in space every other year, every 2 years than in the previous 40. So it's massive. Most of them are much smaller, obviously, hopefully. But this is, and we are going to be more and more dependent on this. If we want to have autonomous vehicles and stop driving, that's going to rely on space assets. So that is becoming such a critical both opportunity, but also vulnerability, that making sure that we maintain this is essential. So it's great working there. And Shepherd Air Force Base is great. I visited Shepherd with the Secretary General a couple of years ago, and it was a fantastic visit.
Oh, Thank you both. This has been a wonderful discussion. Camille, I want to thank NATO, especially to the whole team, for reaching out to the heartland of America and engaging with us. And very reassuring, to see the kind of vision that you bring to your portfolio. And you have an open invitation to visit Alabama, as you heard, in Huntsville, and also down here in Frere University. We hope to see you here soon. Thank you both.
Certainly hope it will happen soon.